has greatly impacted our community, and as they've donated to our museum and other museums in the area. In 2017, they donated a significant collection of contemporary prints by women and African-American artists to the Lipa-Ratner Museum of Art. At the heart of their collection was Louisa Chase's prints and paintings, which we had a mutual love for her work. I met Louisa briefly when I was a young printmaker at the Maryland Institute College of Art, and she was a visiting artist. And I saw this piece that you see on the left, House and Water, which struck me, and I just wanted to know more about her. Jim saw this painting on the right and instantly purchased it, and this piece is now in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in St. Petersburg. Jim's passion and support has spurred us to organize this exhibition, partner with museums throughout Florida, and expand our collection. And we were lucky enough, with his help, to conduct research in New York and Baltimore. And that is how we've become friends with Ted, George, and Andrew, and why they're here today. And I just want to share, this is Jim with Louisa Chase's print Baby Baby that he had recently donated, and his wife, Martha. So this all is for Martha, and celebrating the power of the female voice in contemporary art in this pinnacle year of 2020 that celebrates the centennial of the women's equal right to vote. So now this brings us to sort of a nice roundtable discussion that we'll have. We're going to keep this discussion somewhat casual within this outline that I've provided to give kind of an overview of Louisa's career. In this roundtable discussion, we explore major themes, the creative process and evolution of Louisa's work. Through anecdotes and insights, her 40-year career comes full circle with her constant search to hold a feeling tangible. And what you see here in this slide is kind of a representation of that 40-year career from her early works in the 1970s that deal with the structure of the game and game pieces, and how she moves through the 1980s, the 1990s, and even the 2000s. I'd also like to mention that I believe, I'm not positive, but Louisa's brother may be tuning in from Los Angeles, California to join us as well and listen in. Ben Chase, if you're here, we welcome you. So with that, I want to just give you a little bit of a quick background about Louisa, and then we will kick it off with Andrew, and he will talk a little bit about Louisa's time in Syracuse as a young artist. So Teresa, if we could go to the next slide. My favorite picture ever. Louisa Lisbeth Chase was born in Panama City in Panama in 1951, where her father, a West Point graduate, was stationed. The family moved to Lancaster, Pennsylvania in 1958, where Louisa attended a Quaker-sponsored boarding school. She earned her BFA in printmaking at Syracuse University in 1973 and an MFA in painting at Yale University in 1975. And I'll just tell you that with our panel, this becomes, if you've ever heard of the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, where everybody's related somehow, this would be a good moment for the 6 degrees of Louisa Chase. So Andrew, we're going to click through some slides of Louisa as a young artist in Syracuse University. And if you could talk a little bit about her formative years, and which was full of self-discovery. What was she exploring early on?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Christine. And I just want to congratulate you and the Lipa-Ratner on what was a fantastic exhibition. Is a fantastic exhibition. I had the pleasure of being down there in March, as meeting a lot of you that I see on the Zoom call now, and it's just you've done a fantastic job. But I never knew Louisa personally. We had correspondence late in her life when I was introduced to her work through a shared professor that we had. She had him in the 70s in the beginning of his career. I had him in the 90s at the end, but he had kept a lot of her work, and I was helping Professor Don Cortese clean out his studio, and was just completely entranced by this work. I loved it. I had never seen anything like this from our collections, having working at the Syracuse University Art Collection. And that's where I really was, became hooked on learning more and working with Louisa Chase. In the early time, while she was at Syracuse, Syracuse University, we recently had an exhibition of her prints that was installed in New York City. And actually, Ted, my colleague on the call tonight, Ted, myself, and the director of the Parish Art Museum, Terry Sultan, we had a small panel where Terry, who knew Louisa, she was a colleague at Syracuse University, she talked about how Louisa was really forging her own path right from the very beginning. Not working within the silos of traditional art media and exploring all sorts of different kinds of outlets and medium. And here the slide that's on the screen is a shot of the basement of Smith Hall, where she did a large installation of inflatable sculpture, and she experimented quite a bit with these forms that I've described almost as a Tim Burton-like, quality of eeriness and creature. There's a creature aspect to it that I think is very very alive in a lot of her sculpture. She was experimenting with prints, doing very simple experimentations with printing intaglio plates as relief, in relief, and doing certain variations with traditional media that was trying to push the boundary. I've also been able to see a lot of her work at this time, thanks to Ben Chase, her brother, who sent me a lot of early material, including cartoons that she was drawing for the Syracuse University newspaper, the Daily Orange. She really was a creative machine, just going through all sorts of different kinds of processes and experimenting with different outlets. Here's another wonderful example of a painted canvas hanging form that is also in the basement of one of the art buildings of that time. It's unfortunate that a lot of these works do not any longer exist. I don't believe they exist. I think Ted and I have gone through a few questions there about finding some more of the any remnants of sculpture. But I think you can also see how these works informed the painting, the printmaking that would follow in the decades to come. There's a playfulness, but also a very insightful and kind of there's a darkness to some of them as well that is constantly at play back and forth, and that's a recurring theme that I think started at Syracuse or probably even earlier and continued with her through her entire career.
The next slide, I believe, is that inflatable?
Yes, yeah. This is inflatable. This is it's not a park. I believe this is also in front of Smith Hall on the main campus at Syracuse University. You can see Smith in the back there. Again, one of these fantastic, grotesque, fun, just kind of crazy things to see on campus. At this time at Syracuse University, I should say, this is a time where the School of Art or the College of Visual and Performing Arts, they had an experimental media degree where it wasn't segmented into necessarily painting, printmaking, or traditional kind of media definitions. It was a time when people like Bill Viola were there and experimenting with video and pushing the boundaries of what art actually was, and Louisa was there at that same time.
That's something that I love about this conversation is that I think the four of us have all been through art school, and which is completely it's completely different in that the experience, you have so much freedom to experiment, and that is so exciting to see with inflatable sculpture and someone who becomes known for her paintings, but to see this early work is really inspiring. Now, I want to ask George, when Louisa moved on to Syracuse, this is when you come into the picture, and this was also an important time for her self-discovery. As a graduate student at Yale, Louisa quickly found her voice as a young female artist in the bustling New York art scene of the 70s and 80s. can you share a little bit about your time with Louisa at Yale and what her presence meant in the New York art scene at that time?
Oh, those are two very big questions. So let me start sort of slowly or gradually with Yale, and to just be clear about a couple of things. We intersected at Yale, but I was an undergraduate and she was a graduate student. So I had this sort of privilege of watching 4 years of graduate students go through the graduate department, which of course was 2 years, while I had to make my way through the 4 years. So I met Louisa in the fall of 1973. And it's almost impossible for me to describe what 73 was like, the early 70s. You know, President Nixon was about to resign. New York City was going through a financial crisis that may, in some degrees, match what will happen in the next couple of years now. Imagine that Henry Kissinger had just been made Secretary of State. The Allende coup in Chile had occurred. I mean, all I'm trying to paint is a picture of unbelievable political upheaval throughout the entire world. And in walks Louisa. And one of the first things that I noticed was that I was sure that she was Judy Pfaff's sister, younger sister. And she was wearing pigtails she had pigtails the first time I ever saw her. So I was shocked to find out that she was a graduate student. And she was in an extremely competitive environment where the graduate students were wrestling to get the attention of an Al Held, or a William Bailey, or a Bernie Chait, or even in this photograph, I can see Robert Reed right in the middle with the beard and dark glasses, yet another professor. And by the way, just to his left, in a very sort of casual shirt, is David von Schlegel, the great sculptor.
Wow.
So this was a heady time. And I think to some degree, the faculty wanted to see it as a recreation of the early 60s, when Yale had been able to boast that Robert Mangold, Bryce Martin, Richard Serra, Nancy, I mean, all kinds of artists had really come into fruition during that period of time. And so to many of them, this was possibly going to be a recreation of that moment. So Yale in the early to mid 70s looked very compelling. And I think that New York City was obviously the next step. So graduate students tended to think back then, either my life will be in teaching, or I'm going to New York to forge a career. And Louisa clearly had New York City on her mind. And during those years at Yale, she was exceptionally close to Al Held, and in a sense, Judy Pfaff, because Judy had been one of Al's favorite students. There you can see Al, there's Judy on the far left, and there's Louisa looking much younger than everyone else. But this is actually 76 in New York City, and I don't know exactly where this was taken, but it's downtown. But Judy and Louisa also forged a tremendous relationship that carried over into New York City. But for the most part, Louisa really was sort of the champion of that class, and was the highlight among the graduate students during that period. The transition to New York wasn't very difficult because she had already made friends with, I'm having a senior moment, because of her show at Artist Space. She knew, anyway, she did extremely well almost immediately with her show at Artist Space because, and in fact, she had not graduated. I think it was April of 1975. She didn't graduate until June of that year, but her show at Artist Space coincided with her graduation. So yet again, another very unusual step in the career of any artist, let alone a very young woman coming out of Yale at that time. There was a lot of attention on Louisa during those initial years in New York. And it felt as if her success was going to be inevitable. She came at a certain moment where minimalism was challenged in many respects by the younger artists, and in particular by female artists, who Susan Rothenberg in particular, who really reintroduced figuration, representation, and all kinds of issues that male-dominated era didn't really necessarily accept. And again, New York at that time was a convergence of so many energies and artists wanting to sort of break out of some kind of pattern. It was not surprising to me that her success was that imminent. And I think by 1979, Robert Miller had taken her on, and she started to show very successfully with Bob Miller. But I think in order to summarize those years, I mean, there was this inevitable force that seemed to make it clear that Louisa was going to succeed.
And I always had this image. It seems like Louisa had some great champions that were some of the older artists, and I wondered if she was, I mean, I know she was a very serious artist and worked all the time. What probably wasn't hanging out as much in the clubs with like Jean-Michel Basquiat, or I wondered if like, you know, where she, if she was just working all the time or was out and about in the city.
Well, again, it's difficult to imagine that while there had been this convergence of artists in New York City, the scene itself wasn't enormous. I mean, people got highlighted. People discussed Louisa. The word was out that there was this young artist making fantastic work. There was an exchange of information that was fluid. She had already shown at Artist Space, and so that was a tremendous stamp of approval. I think that the hanging out was part of it, but that was more, I think, companionship for artists.
Yeah.
They tended to go to bars or clubs, but I think the word of mouth and the critical attention and even the gallery attention, Robert Miller, was an enormous driving force in what brought Louisa to the attention of so many people at that time.
Well, and I think, you know, as she was a rising star in the scene in the 1980s, and being represented by these major galleries, and she was also doing a lot of prints and doing a lot of editions with Diane Villani and Brooke Alexander. She was featured in these big exhibitions like the Venice Biennale, and she had a traveling exhibition that was organized by the Contemporary Art Museum in Boston. But she started getting into this imagery where her prints and paintings became more emotionally charged. And you'll see in the next couple of slides where she was using the natural landscape, heavy mark making, and pictographs like hands and torsos to apply this duality in a presence in her work that they almost became like interior self-portraits. And her images and color relationships became her alphabet for this unspoken universal language that expressed a range of emotions. But I thought it was interesting that she's she's so young still, but she's at the height of her career almost already in 1985. And her imagery becomes, increasingly agitated, and this duality is very bold. And all of a sudden, she has this bold move where she kind of walks away from everything. She cancels her upcoming exhibitions, and she leaves behind this symbolist iconography that she'd become so well known for. This really is a question for all three of you. How does she break away at such an important time in her career and work through this transition? She kind of reinvents herself, and this is like 1985. This is an early painting that Ted had shown us when I was at Hirschl Adler Modern. So I'd like for Ted first to kind of talk about how she transitioned in trying to find this new language. Or did we lose Ted? Well, it's okay because we have other experts on the panel. Maybe Andrew, would you like to talk about this? She's, starting to experiment with.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, okay.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
Yeah, I was muted for some reason. What I was going to say is that Luisa was not necessarily a victim of her own success, but as you touched on, she had all of this attention so quickly. And a lot of artists need those years to flounder right after school to really find their language and what they're interested in. And Luisa, for better or for worse, didn't get that opportunity to really flounder and figure out what her language is. And she was an obsessive journal and records keeper her entire career. And there are wonderful journals from 1984 from a Robert Miller show where she just chronicled every day working on these paintings for her show. And the one thing she kept talking about was the phenomenology that she was interested in. It wasn't that she wanted to depict a storm, she wanted to paint a storm. And she didn't want to illustrate a fire. She wanted the painting to be fire. She was much more interested in the pure phenomenon and expressing phenomenon versus creating an image. That wasn't really her desire. And so I think by 1984, after that Robert Miller show, I think she had come away with the idea that her work was too illustrative and that she wasn't getting at what she desired out of her work. She wanted that pure expression, that pure engagement in the making, that actual physicality, that phenomenon of making a painting. And I think that's what it was. And she gave a talk at Skowhegan in 1985 where she goes really in depth about this. And it was just that she needed a break. She had reached the sort of the terminus of that body of work. And she needed that break in abstraction, and specifically abstract expressionism, I think gave that to her. And she became much more in love with the gesture and the physicality of making a mark. And that's what she went after. I think that my own feeling is that you can never really separate who you are as an artist. I think that you have these things that you do, and no matter how often you try to hide them or work against them or bury them, they still come through. And I think at heart, Luisa was always an imagist and a symbolist, and that no matter how much she just wanted to make abstract paintings, she couldn't really do it. She always returned to the form or something, some sort of symbol is somehow. I mean, if you look at Nowhere Now Here, I mean, yes, it's very graphic and abstract, but there's still a figure in it. And there's still a firm symbolism sort of grounding the work. And so it always sort of crept back in. Even the latest paintings, you know, like circa 2011 from her Halsey McKay show, you look at them and they look very geometric, very abstract, but there's still something there grounding it in some kind of reality, some kind of symbol. And so I think that she had this early body of work, she worked through it, and she wanted more. And any artist wants that. You know, you don't want to just sort of make the same painting over and over and over again. And she worked through one situation and was excited to try something new.
I've often wondered, and actually I'm going to ask this question to George and Ted, please, you know, chime in as well. But reading through the all of the reviews that were being published around that time, especially the Robert Miller show, would she react to that? Because it did seem like that could become suffocating, right? The imagery, the way they were describing the imagery, the way that the public and the critics were reacting to it, that I could see, you know, to use Ted's description, you know, wanting to, you know, kind of break free from the refined and the simplistic pictogram style imagery, and then, you know, trying to create the emotion and trying to capture the intangible, like we quote her so often. George, would she read her reviews?
You know, that's a very interesting question. And in all the years that we discussed all kinds of things about painting, I never remember Louisa ever referring to a review, let alone a critic. She cared a lot about what Elizabeth Murray might think, or what Susan Rothenberg might think, or what Bryce Martin might think. I mean, she wanted to feel that she was in the company of artists. Critics, I really don't. I didn't feel it. I didn't see it. I didn't hear it. But back to this idea, two quick points. One thing that Ted brought up. I mean, Louisa was very young, but Frank Stella was younger. In other words, she knew that she was in a kind of landscape where young people were getting a lot of attention. And she was one of those artists, and she didn't necessarily feel that there was anything all that exceptional about it. I'm not sure that on an emotional level, I think it may have taken her years to understand what that success meant. And maybe what I mean is the extent to which the success became a bit of a block later on. But she never seemed very impressed with her own success. She seemed ambitious about wanting to understand her own pictorial necessities. And
I mean, the journals reflect that. It's always about, she wanted to get better, not for anybody else's sake. She wanted to get better for her own sake.
Absolutely. And when she discussed other artists, I mean, she discussed Jackson Pollock. I mean, in other words, her ambitions and her goals were that big, seriously that big. And she wanted to understand what Pollock went through. She wanted to understand what she was going through. And she desperately wanted to sort out some very challenging pictorial issues. And back to something that Ted said earlier, yes, the subject matter always counted. And she was well aware of that. She was aware of the fact that she wanted a degree of abstraction, but that she was not going to make a Pollock drip painting, that it had to be grounded in something that she considered real. I'm not sure that she would have used the word symbolic, but certainly real, grounded in a reality that was hers and was really something that she had witnessed outside of herself, not just inside of herself. I think she wanted that balance between the interior and the exterior. Now, of course, we know, or we should know, that as a painter, those are the most challenging goals that a painter can have. It's a balancing act that is even treacherous. And I think Louisa was willing to go there. And I think the early paintings were a bit of a shock, not only to her, but to the public. but it was evident to me that she was going to just continue to sort of elbow, I like to use this word about Louisa, she sort of elbowed her way into new territory. And it's striking because in 1984 or 85, as you discuss this sort of crisis in subject matter or in content, I don't remember it. I don't remember her ever canceling. I mean, she was ready to cancel everything at any moment. So it wasn't necessarily that much of a threat. I mean, she liked to be that difficult with herself. I thought that the transition from 85 to 87 was more challenging. And it was that period where after the Robert Miller show of 1986, that Robert Miller actually had a very difficult time with, and she left Bob Miller. That was a moment that was very challenging, and she felt sort of at a loss. But I remember walking into that show in 1986 at Robert Miller, and I was shocked. I mean, I was shocked not only because it was that much closer to a kind of abstraction that I perhaps love and admire, although I always loved and admired Louisa's work, but the scale of those paintings was beyond belief. And I remember walking into that 57th Street gallery and looking at the paintings in this beautiful light, and it really was shocking.
That is a really good insight, and it segues nicely into another sort of related question, which I think it's rare that artists have an aha moment. They might have one, and they kind of find their voice, and then they continue with that for their career. But as she describes her own work as this kamikaze curiosity, she has a couple of these aha moments, which one centers around what we were just talking about, but also in the 2000s. And she had, of course, a lot of inspiration, but I was hoping that either Andrew or Ted could kind of talk more about her kind of second aha moment, which Andrew had a page of her journal that kind of writes about that and how she created illusion and space with lines in some of her later works. And if Teresa, if you want to forward through that for a second, just to, yeah, right there. If you guys could talk about that moment too, I think it's pretty special that she was able to kind of reinvent herself a couple of times.
Yeah, so this is from the Louisa Chase papers that are here at Syracuse, and when I first read these, when I found these pages and started reading through the way she described the work at this time, and I believe she's specifically talking about the painting Flutter here, but it really does, it transcends that one painting. I think thinking of it as the Rosetta Stone, the style, the approach, what she's able to capture, both in the literal aspect of it, but also the gestural and the emotional aspect, all in one, coming together without a lot of delineation between form and color and mark. I mean, it seemed like everything's just started to click. And again, to reiterate what Ted was saying, that she, and George, that it was a constant exploration that she was trying to get to. And to the point you were making before about that transition, the aha moments, you see it in the sketchbooks. You see her just constantly trying to, find that right mark. And these journals that she kept in the sketchbooks are really, they're invaluable to us now, and they bring some fantastic insight into the work.
Teresa, if you could advance to the next slide or two, I just want to show what we're talking about. Even though it's so different from what she was doing before, she really has refined her language into this amazing sort of landscape of that's almost like pure sound to me. I mean, you can almost hear these bees buzz, but seeing these pieces in person, and that's why I encourage people, if you live in the area, to come see this exhibition, because to experience her work in person is a whole different level. But you can kind of see, zooming in, how she's figured out a way to create these lines that weave in and out of each other, much like a Jackson Pollock painting. And I think it goes far beyond like what Cy Twombly was doing, who she often got compared to. Moving on to, you know, in the 90s, I feel like her work, this kind of goes back a little bit, but in the 90s, her work kind of lightens up quite a bit. And she's using, as you can see behind me in Nowhere Now Here, these white fields, as she's finding this language that includes the abstract mark and geometry. But it was also at a time where she moved from downtown New York City out to the Hamptons. And in 1991, she actually bought her friend Susan Rothenberg's house in Sag Harbor, and she called it, from what I understand, she called it Camp Lucy after her dog. And she kept a boat in the yard and sailed, and she eventually settled into another home in East Hampton. But I wanted to ask George, since you've had such a similar experience, how do you think that transition from the city to country life affected Louisa's work and her creative process and her work habits?
Well, a couple of things I think need to be cleared up. I mean, she lived out here for quite some time, and she had kept a foot out here for quite some time. But she was also very clearly interested in keeping her foot in New York City too. So she liked the sort of duality. On another level, she loved the outdoors. She was a sports person. She loved to sail. She just loved to be out in nature. So all of that made an awful lot of sense. But in terms of the actual impact on the work, I'm really not that sure. I think she loved this studio that we're looking at right now. I think and by the way, this is a studio that was next door to her house and was in fact built by the artist Peter Busa, who was an Indian space painter from the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Wow.
And she found that her own studio in her house next door was too small. And yet again, she wanted to make very big paintings, so this became her studio for at least the last decade, maybe more. Yeah, more than that. But I think that nature was always played a role in the work, whether she was in New York or out in the Hamptons. I think that it was that force of nature. It was all the elements that meant so much to her. I just think it was part of a kind of pluralism that she had been excavating for years. And maybe the Hamptons helped bring some of that into fruition. I'm not entirely sure. I'm still thinking about that particular issue.
Well, it seems like during that time, just to flip it to printmaking for a second, she was highly productive as a painter, but she was also really, really highly productive and collaborative as a printmaker, and was a visiting artist for colleges and print workshops around the country. And of course, that's how I came to know of her. She produced more than 60 editions, which I know Andrew is all knowledgeable about now as he works with the catalog Resonate he's working on. And she worked with the master printers to experiment with new techniques, which brings me to Baltimore, which, Teresa, if we could go back to slide 29 and 30. In 1997, just to backtrack a little bit, she came to Baltimore to work with a newly established print workshop, Goya Girl Press, and was introduced to solar etching. and worked with a variety of techniques while she was there. And I know that not too many people might be familiar with solar etching, but she did quite a bit of it at Goya Girl. And I was wondering if you go back one more slide to, yes, that one. Andrew, can you explain what solar etching is, and how did this and other printmaking techniques impact Louisa's paintings?
Sure. Well, solar plate etching is a non-toxic process, and there was a big, still a strong movement, but a movement that began, I think, in the early '80s, late '70s, to try and explore different ways to recreate some of the traditional processes without a lot of the toxic materials. Because, as you know, you and I have talked about at length, and anybody familiar with print processes on the call, is that you know, you're dealing with some, you know, pretty bad stuff, some pretty toxic materials, whether it's, you know, a kerosene bath to clean a plate, or a lacquer thinner, or even the acid baths that you're using for your etching. These are pretty caustic materials. I spoke with Dan Weldon. I've spoken with Dan Weldon quite a bit about. He is an innovator of the process. He never actually worked formally with Louisa, but he's also on Long Island, and he knew of her and helped her with some of these elements. I've thought a lot about this, about why she made the jump, and I think the ability to first of all start doing work in her own studio on Mylar sheets, and then what you're doing is you're exposing you're exposing your imagery onto a photopolymer plate that is hardened by the sun or by ultraviolet light, and then the elements of it wash away with water. So it's really a water-based etching process. And the ability to, you know, work through the layering and the imagery, and then to be able to, you know, bring those Mylar, those transparencies, or even send them to Baltimore to have them exposed and manipulated. I think that's a pragmatic decision, I think, but I also know that there was a lot that you can do with these plates that in a more expedient fashion that you can't necessarily do with the traditional process. I have students right now, as you said, we're working on this catalog raisonné, and I have students researching with me now, trying to document all of the variations that she did, all of the different proofs in different states, and it's really wonderful to see things from that satellite point of view. You know, to be able to see the entirety of the work. 40 years of prints all in a line. It's insightful. As far as, you know, how it impacted her painting, I'm actually going to let the painters talk about that. I don't know if Ted or George, you have some insight there.
Andrew, one thing I wanted to add about this period, and in particular Goya Girls and Louisa going to Baltimore and meeting Martha, for her it became a whole universe. I mean, it was very exciting. There was a tremendous amount of energy around her work at Goya Girl. I mean, it was a phenomenal moment for her, and she cherished it. And it was glorious for Louisa to have that semblance of enormous success again. And I think she was thrilled to have that. She was energized. And it was extremely vital to her. I remember I went down with her on one occasion because she was she had a wonderful show there. But I think we have to head back to something else that's in the journal that was a kind of the subtext of this moment. And that's in that sentence where she describes what it was like to destroy work and to destroy paintings. And one of the things about printmaking was that she never, I never felt that she had that destructive relationship with printmaking. With painting, it was different at times, and both because of the physicality of painting, the requirements that she had about painting, and then sometimes the frustration she would feel when she couldn't get beyond a certain sort of expectation that she might have about an image. And so the paintings became, unfortunately, more frustrating for her. I always felt that the printmaking was this wonderful avenue into a frictionless world for her. And you can see how the touch, the light, the color, oftentimes just seem so much more at ease and available to Louisa.
George, I've often wondered if the fact that, you know, with the paintings, was there a certain isolation that she had, because it's her in the canvas, it's her in the work, whereas with the print process, you know, by nature, there's a collaborative environment, almost a support system. I mean, do you think that there's anything to that?
You know, I can't say no to that, but that was never, again, my sense of the difference. I think that when you look at the paintings, oftentimes what Louisa had done was she had figured out a way to sort of carve into paintings by putting, not all the time, but most of the time. And she would put down a black ground and then a white ground in oil paint. And it gave her the ability to incise into the white ground a black mark that would be revealed. Now, in reality, that's more of a printmaking technique to some degree than a painting technique. So if you can imagine that what it was like for Louisa to actually apply paint on a surface, there was a real struggle with that as an issue, not with the early work, but with the later work. So while she always had this lush and very beautiful physicality to her paintings, one of the odd things for me was that the physicality of the paintings also represented a kind of undoing for her, as it became a kind of block in terms of how to get to the image that she really wanted. So that was a real challenge. And
but you know, it's interesting because like that to me is the most interesting narrative about her career, is the way she builds a painting. I always sort of felt like she never really got over being a sculptor, and that she sort of turned her attention to painting, but she still made paintings the same way you would make a sculpture. She builds a painting rather than makes a painting. And I found it interesting getting to know the work that, you know, she would, the first paintings, you know, from the early 70s, you know, the early slides, there's a lot of paint there that she builds up. And then all of a sudden, starting early 80s through the mid 90s, she's actually, as to say, paraphrase George earlier, she's excavating into the surface. All of a sudden, she's now going in, and she's not building up, but she's now going into the substrate of the painting itself, and really still invested in materials, but she's going at it a different way. And then when Flutter happens in the early 2000s, she's no longer excavating, but she's back to building the surface up again. And I think that the correlation between the work of circa 2000 and later and being with Goya Girl in the late 90s, I think that they're directly related, because printmaking is almost always an additive process in a certain respect. I mean, you don't really ever go back into the surface of the print. It's hard to remove a layer. And I think that understanding of layering and layering and layering for a print, I think that started to infiltrate how she viewed painting. And it helped her get over the block of how much more can I excavate into a painting to get at what I want. And so for me, you know, the role of printmaking, I always sort of felt that printmaking for Louisa was a way to figure something out. Where some artists will sketch or make preliminary sketches, paintings, which she did, I think ultimately she really worked out the most of her ideas by making prints, which again, to me, speaks to more of a sculptor mind versus a painter's mind. Because I think that I don't know why, Andrew could maybe explain it to me, but I've always sort of felt that sculptors make better drafts people and better printmakers almost always than painters do. And I don't know if it's because of the physicality or the process, but I'm always much more engaged by a sculptor's prints than I am a painter's prints for whatever reason. And so I think that that's just how her mind worked. And that's where she was really singing.
Ted, we won't tell Jasper Johns what you just said.
Right, 100%. And the whole time I was saying that, I'm thinking the one person that breaks that rule is Jasper Johns. But I still think that I still think that he figures things out through printmaking. He just does it afterwards. I think that he's figured out a motif and then he understands it more deeply and pushes the imagery through printmaking.
And
I don't think he.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, I think that, and by the way, I've had 5 associations since you started talking. Everybody talks about Philip Guston and the influence of Guston on Louisa, but it was really Alexander Calder, whom she went to visit all the time when she was at Yale. And she was obsessed with Alexander Calder. So that does support the sculpture dimension of your argument. She made sculpture at Yale. And I remember one year it was devoted to small toys and automobiles that were remarkable. But I think it was really, I think it was Elizabeth Murray as a kind of, she idealized Elizabeth to the point where she could take all these elements, the very physical and the painterly and the image, and bring it all together. So I think it was Elizabeth Murray, and to some extent Susan Rothenberg, who opened her eyes to this kind of intersection of painting and sculpture. That's all I was going to say.
Well, and then you see that also with the way she starts building canvases too, where again, and this is earlier, right? She starts to take them as segments, as individual objects, and then playing with the blocks of the canvas, putting it together, and it's illustrated in the prints the way that she's layering, you know, the lino cut on top of an etching or a lithograph, and I mean, it's just, I think George, I think that's very insightful. I think you're right on the mark there.
Thank you.
We have just a few more minutes before we open it up to questions and answers. And I'm going to kind of skip over some of the general things just to make sure that we talk about how her work is relevant today. But you know, since Louisa, she was diagnosed with cancer in around 2010. And she was able to still find this language and refine her visual language into this purest form of color and geometric shape and expressive line, very sculptural, still influences of printmaking and layering. Unfortunately, she passed away in 2016, but thankfully, she has the 3 of you who are working on her behalf in different ways. Ted working with the estate through Hirschl Adler Modern. George's wife, actually, Verva Hinemo, is instrumental in maintaining Louisa's studio space and has been cataloging all of her backlog of prints and paintings and sketchbooks. And then, of course, Andrew has been working very hard with Syracuse University with the Louisa Chase papers and planning exhibitions. There's been several exhibitions, and I know you've got something coming up soon. A big question, just if we take a few minutes, how do you think Louisa's work is relevant today, considering our current situation here in 2020 as we're dealing with, obviously, the pandemic, protests for equality, politics, the environment? How do you think all of this would have impacted her work and impacted her? This question is to any of you guys.
That's such a big question. I mean, Louisa would not have been happy about a pandemic.
No.
And certainly not politically, she would have been as unhappy as I am, if not more so. But on a cultural level, and I think where I find myself a little bit surprised is that I think that Louisa's at the beginning of a whole new narrative. And I think that when I picture the thousands of works on paper that I have actually seen, the prints, the paintings, there is a very long story to be told. I think it should be told slowly. I think it's a complicated story. I think there are some valleys and peaks, but this idea of pluralism, and when I look at the interests that younger artists have in bringing all kinds of elements into a work of art, so to speak, Luisa becomes a kind of pinnacle in terms of that conversation, dialogue, you name it. I think Luisa is going to look more relevant every year. And I think she talked to me about it. We discussed this, and she didn't think this would happen. And now here we are, and I have to chuckle because I'm thinking, Luisa, look what's going on. A lot of people are talking about you, your work, and the meaning of it in a period of time that maybe you, Luisa, could not have predicted. So, you know, all kinds of things are possible, and it's great, and what a testament to you and your museum, but to all of this effort. It really is a resurrection of a whole cultural force from the 60s, 70s, 80s that needs to be seen and addressed. So I think it's fabulous. I couldn't be happier.
I think that's actually really spot on, George. I don't think any of us could really top that. I mean, just looking back when I met her in 96, 97 as a student and thinking that her work, she was ahead of her time at that time. And I feel like everything is just kind of catching up to her now. So it's, I think those were good words. I think that we have some time for some questions and answers. Teresa, I'll open it up to you to see who's been typing in some comments.
Well, we've got a couple of comments, but you know, again, to the audience, please go ahead and send in your chat messages here. We have one question about the home and her home studio. Is that open to the public, or is it available for other scholars or artists to sort of have access to some of her journals and works? It's,
you know, George can help me answer this. It's not really open to the public. The studio is lovingly owned and maintained by the woman on which it sits. But on the property, it's on a property owned by a woman that Luisa rented the studio from, and she has very graciously continued to allow the studio to exist as is, and for the paintings to remain there, her paints, a lot of her papers. It still maintains sort of Luisa's spirit, but it's not open to the public, and it's mostly just sort of there to sort of maintain and warehouse the paintings and just sort of keep everything in one space. As far as scholarship is concerned, all of the good stuff is with Andrew up in Syracuse. And so if you are looking to dive into the papers and the notes, a lot of that is with Andrew, and you can make an appointment to see that up at Syracuse. But the studio is still kept very private, and we don't necessarily want a whole bunch of people driving up and knocking on this woman's door asking to get into the studio to see it.
Yeah, I mean, I need to thank Ted, and I feel like I'm always thanking Ted and George and Verva and Ben Chase. We're very lucky that we've been able to build this archive for Luisa at Syracuse. I thought it was important early on that if someone was going to be if somebody was going to be telling the story, Syracuse University needed to be that central hub. Syracuse University needed to be involved. So we do have the papers, which are accessible. In times when there is not a pandemic, you are welcome to come into the reading rooms of the Special Collections Research Center and dive into a lot of the journals and the material that we have. And we also have a almost complete collection of her prints in our art collection, which is a separate entity on campus. But to have those two resources in one place, it's invaluable, and it's hopefully it's going to inspire a lot more research.
Great, thank you. Follow-up sort of question is, as a printmaker, did Louisa do any mono prints? That's a question coming in.
Did she do mono prints? The answer is boy, did she do mono prints. That's one element that I have actually yet to unpack and start to investigate for the research that I'm doing. She was incredibly prolific, and it actually goes back to something I wanted to say when Ted was talking about her process, about thinking of the print as almost in a sketchbook-like quality, trying to figure things out and to find the image. I think that she was doing that in the hundreds and hundreds of monoprints that she created in Baltimore and throughout her career.
I'd actually like to add to that, Teresa, if you could go back to slide number 28. I'm sorry, I know it's kind of slow. One thing that we didn't get to really address, but it's in the exhibition if you come visit. Luisa actually was the first of a series of visiting artists that came to the University of Tampa, who had the University of, this is it, yeah. This is a monoprint from a series that she did with a newly established program at the time in 1990 at University of Tampa, which was Studio F. The Tampa Bay area is really lucky to have had several really high-profile printmaking workshops, including Graphic Studio at USF, Studio F at UT, and Berghoff Cowden Editions, which we have a great collection of prints by Miriam Shapiro and other artists. But this series of monoprints were not only something I'd never seen any of her monoprints before, but the fact that she came to Tampa in 1990 and produced these is pretty amazing. This piece comes from the Polk Museum of Art. But the fact that she was the first artist that they thought of to invite down to be a collaborator and to work with their students, I think is pretty impressive.
I just wanted to add an anecdote. Louisa and I and Philip Smith, another fabulous artist, had a 3-person show in Miami in 1990.
Oh, really?
And the beauty of the show was that we all got to the airport in Newark at the same time, and we missed the flight and we missed the opening. And I will never forget getting to Miami and thinking, this is what it feels like to miss one's own opening. I did it with Louisa and Philip Smith, and we laughed, thank God, but we laughed.
Well, if you're going to miss a flight, it's good to be in good company, at least. and I understand.
One other thing about the prints, Louisa really did feel that painting was a labor-intensive process. I mean, she really did feel that all these elements had to be kind of realized over a period of time. I think that the spontaneity of printmaking, the idea that the image might happen faster, was very attractive to her. And obviously she was very gifted at it. And so I think the idea of these two creative impulses happening side by side was absolutely ideal for Louisa.
We've got another question here. So when we were speaking in the panel discussion about sort of what would Louisa think of the world today and what would she make of it, question came in, do you think that her work might help us to reconcile current social upheavals? And if so, how?
That's a thinker.
Yeah.
That's not a quick answer.
Yeah. I just keep coming back to thinking, and I'm looking to George to correct me on this, but I keep coming back to thinking about how for Louisa, I always sort of felt like the work started from an inward place where she was looking at herself and she was looking at her own world and her own experiences and just trying to make sense of those. And I think, and I wonder how she felt about people latching on to her own experiences and her own explorations, and how she felt about people then trying to make readings about their own life based off of the same painting, if that makes sense. You know, sort of like she was always so much in her own moment, in her own head, in her own emotions when she was making the work, that did she ever stop to realize how it would be interpreted by someone that wasn't herself?
I think it meant an awful lot to Louisa to have this idea that a painting could impart emotional, all things emotional, all things real to her. And that idea that it could make contact and connect with somebody. Those were absolutely, she believed that. It was a belief. And that belief came from a whole tradition of painting that we know about. And whether it was the 40s, 50s, the abstract expressionists, this idea that painting was communication and is communication. Now, how do you reconcile in a world like today? Because the challenges are different. And I think that what she would say, I can hear her almost saying, is I can make contact with all kinds of people in what I do best. And because I do this with all the feeling in the world, if somebody, anybody begins to sense what it is that I'm feeling, well, that is a corrective emotional experience. And I live for that, and I hope that can be the case. I know that Louisa had very strong political beliefs. I know that she had very strong social beliefs. I know that she loved animals as much as anybody. She was very, very connected to the world. I'm not sure that we could get into I'm not sure I could decipher something beyond what I would call the emotional, existential belief that painting can change the world. I mean, Cézanne said one of these days, a lemon, I think he said it was a lemon, will be observed to such a degree that it will cause a revolution. Now, if Cézanne knew that, I know Louisa knew that. So I'll believe that that was the case.
I'd like to segue off of that actually just for a brief moment. As we've been preparing for this program for the past couple days, our curatorial prep assistant, Emmy, was very sweet to send this wonderful quote, and I'm sorry, I don't know where it came from, but I wanted to read it because it definitely applies to what George just said. When we create or appreciate art, we set free the spirit trapped within. That is why art arouses such joy. Art, whether skillfully executed or not, is the emotion, the pleasure of expressing life as it is. Those who see art are moved by its passion and strength, its intensity and beauty. That is why it is impossible to separate life from art. Political and economic developments may seem to dominate the news, but culture and education are the forces that actually shape an age, since they transform the human heart. Sorry, I had to share that. I thought that was wonderful.
It is wonderful.
Do we have any other questions, Teresa?
Yeah, and I think we have time for one more. I'm going to go back to slide number 19. Our question asks, in the early 80s, some of the undertones of her work was pretty unsettling. Does anybody on our panel have any insights to that?
And was that, I guess that was the Red Sea and Cloudburst?
Yes.
I think that this goes back to what I was talking about, sort of her own, my reading interpretation of the work is that she used art painting, printmaking, drawing, to explore her own emotional states and her own feelings, and almost as a way to make sense of her own world and sort of her place within it. And so, you know, when she talks about when there's a painting of a storm, there are these moments in the journal where she says, all I'm trying to do is just paint a damn storm. But I think that the storm was always this metaphor for her own feeling, her own experience, and just trying to get at something emotionally through this very universal content or image. And, you know, I was not lucky enough to be in the studio with her when she was making. I know George was. And so, you know, I'd love to hear his own experiences, but I always sort of felt that she was able to tap into something where she could focus on her own emotional state or her own feelings and create a painting that it immediately felt universal and was able to connect to people, as George had mentioned previously.
Ted, that was wonderful, but there's also the other part of the story, and that's that artists use creativity to express themselves or so on. But painting uses the artist also, and uses up the artist. And there are ways that you can get caught into a kind of conflict as a painter where you're not really quite sure who's guiding whom, if that's even what it looks like from that point of view. And there is a pathology to anybody's painting. And Louisa and I talked about psychoanalysis. We used to argue about Freud. We used to argue about James Hillman, who was a Jungian who we both admired. We talked about soul murder, which was a very big part of what Hillman wrote about. And she was very, very well aware of the darker elements of one's psyche. And I think that if you start to decipher some of these paintings, these early paintings, or even the late paintings for that matter, you see the tension, you see the drama, and you see to some extent the narrative. I think that there are certain things about Luisa that should remain sort of private, and I don't really feel that I want to discuss those things. But I know that life, like for many of us, was a struggle, and a struggle to create on a consistent basis puts you in touch with quite a few demons. And that was a part of what Luisa had to face, and it was not easy. On the other hand, when you are moved and even shaken by what you see from Luisa, it's because she was aware of those things. It was not because she was not aware of those things. So I think that would be the way that I would want to sort of state what I think is a very, very difficult but real part of what Luisa was faced with as an artist.
And I'll add to that, if you see that and you understand it and that's your reading of the work, then you also need to acknowledge that Luisa was really good, because an artist of lesser ability would not have been able to communicate that to you as deeply or as effectively. And I think that the fact that, you know, whoever asked that question felt those things by the image, well, that just speaks to how really good she was.
Well, I hope that that's what I was saying. And I meant that. I meant that shows you how real Luisa was as a person and as a painter. And if you doubt what I'm saying, read the biography on Agnes Martin, and you will see what the challenges are like for people who really need to create fantastic works of art. It's a challenge. And Agnes Martin probably is a great testament to the kinds of things that I'm referring to in terms of what it's like to be an artist in this day and age. Yeah, and Luisa made great art because she struggled to that extent. Yeah.
Well, I think as you're creating, you kind of, whatever you're experiencing, once you get it out and confront it, it's not as scary. Like her 4 Fears portfolio, where, you know, there are they're fun childlike illustrations of, you know, swarms of bees and scary clowns, and those things might be something that she was really bothered by, but once she kind of addressed that, especially in a childlike way, they might not be as scary. Much like as soon as she gets this out, she's kind of confronted it and can move on. And I find that in my own artwork that I never realized until recently, doing the same thing by painting weather or snakes, or those were all things that were really scary, and now they're not as scary because I've confronted it. Do we have any time for more questions, or should we leave it at that?
I think that's a good place to end it.
Well, great. We just have one more slide actually at the end, slide 41. This has been an absolute honor to talk with all of you and to have such a wonderful, diverse audience, which from some of the comments, I realized that, that there are people tuning in from all over the country to listen, and it's just been so wonderful, and we can't thank you guys enough for spending some time with us in our little museum down here in sunny Tarpon Springs, Florida. So thank you for joining us. This exhibition will be on view through September 6th. So if you're able to come, we would love to have you. I'd love to show you around. And for more information, you can actually see the Louisa Chase exhibition on our website. We have, Teresa put together a wonderful presentation with all of the images and all of the exhibition text, so you can read to your heart's desire. And one final thing, we are really honored to be nominated by Creative Loafing's Best of the Bay 2020. We've been nominated in 3 categories for Best Museum Exhibition, Louisa Chase, What Lies Beneath, and Best Visual Arts Curator, which would be me, but not to boast. But we're thrilled. You can log on to Creative Loafing's website, which you see in the graphic there. It's BOTB for Best of the Bay, TampaBay.com, and just go through the categories in arts and culture, and you'll see Best Museum, Best Exhibition, and Best Visual Arts Curator. So we thank you from the bottom of our hearts and hope you stay safe and happy and healthy. And we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you so much.
Good
This was
boy.
fun.
What a joy. Thank you.